This is the account of the division of the days of the law and the testimony for annual observance according to their weeks of years and their jubilees throughout all the years of the world, just as the Lord told it to Moses on Mount Sinai when he went up to receive the tablets of the law and the commandment by the word of the Lord, as he said to him, "Come up to the top of the mountain." As far as we can tell, they've been carbon dated to sometime between 150 and 1 BC. The most shocking thing, the most amazing thing about Jubilees, I think for most people, is just the fact that we have a text that radically re-envisions the Torah, re-envisions Genesis in the 1st century BC. So there's definitely a concept of the stories behind Genesis being important, but there is no concept of that they're so holy in their textual form that they have to remain that way. Because the author of Jubilees can go in and say, nope, the calendar was wrong, the patriarchs did things right, all the laws were on a heavenly tablet that you've never heard about, and everything else can be crafted and changed and fixed in certain ways without it being a problem.
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Today we're dealing with the Book of Jubilees with an expert on the topic, Dr. Matthew Munger. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I definitely appreciate you on that, as well as coming on today. For those who don't know who you are, I'm going to give you guys his background. Matthew Munger is the associate professor of Near Eastern languages and literatures at MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion, and Society in Oslo, Norway. He has a BA and MA in theology, as well as a BA in linguistics and an MA in Semitic philology. He was awarded his PhD in 2018 for a dissertation on the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts of the Book of Jubilees, which we're discussing today. Dr. Munger's research covers a variety of subjects related to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the reception history of Jewish and Christian literature. He has also published a Norwegian translation of the West African Fulani epic tale Kaidara. And I look forward to seeing what we have today. Just to tease people, it's going to get heavy. We're doing a presentation. I'm going to want to do a follow-up live episode with you on MythVision, so you get to ask your questions and get them answered by Dr. Munger. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Thanks a lot for having me, Derek. I've been looking forward to doing this. Yeah. So again, thanks a lot for bringing me on the show, Derek. I do really enjoy a lot of what you've done, and feel honored to be in that kind of group of people that have gotten to be on your show. Actually, you've got I think some of the people you've had on are such high quality scholars that it could be like a reading list for anyone interested in trying to do a PhD in religion or the Bible or something like that. So this is a great place to do stuff. So I want to talk about the Book of Jubilees. So I did my PhD on Jubilees, and the reason I got interested in Jubilees was actually because of working with Semitic philology. I started out studying theology, and when I had taken the biblical languages, I kind of felt like a lot of questions didn't get answered very well in class. Like there was kind of, you just kind of have to accept it. So I decided to do a degree in linguistics and then follow that up with a degree in Semitic philology, where I had to learn, of course, a ton of Semitic languages. And when I was working with Ethiopic, I was talking to one of the professors of Old Testament here at MF in Oslo, and she said, "Oh, well, you should read Jubilees. Like that's the best book you can read. That's so cool." Because Jubilees is only known in its complete text through Ethiopic. Okay, and that's like the cool thing about Jubilees is that Jubilees is a text that we do have evidence of in a bunch of different languages, a bunch of contexts, but it's only survived in Ethiopic in its entirety. And it's a text that we've known about for a long time. So scholars have known about it for a really long time, but didn't have access to it actually the whole time. So in in literature, when you read about the Book of Jubilees, so there's like the Ethiopic version of it is what you're basically referring to. And in Ethiopic, it's called the Matzchafa Kufale, which basically means the Book of the Divisions. So it's about the divisions of time, and in the Book of Jubilees, we'll get back to this, is the division of time is into the years of Jubilees, which is like every 7 times 7 years, so every 49 years. But Jubilees was known to scholars long before these manuscripts of Jubilees were discovered in the 1840s, 1850s in Ethiopia. Like a missionary actually brought it back to Germany and gave it to a professor who read it and was like, dude, this is the book we've been looking for, because throughout like Byzantine literature, so Greek literature, from the, say, up to the 1300s, we have these world histories, these universal histories and chronographies that are written that cite a book called Heleptogenesis or Leptogenesis, which means little Genesis or the little Genesis or the details of Genesis or something like that. But it's a quote, or it's a text that's quoted just again and again and again in Greek literature. And there are some collections of quotes that seem to have just been passed around. And so the Leptogenesis was known by scholars long before the book showed up. And in the course of the 1850s, 1860s, some German scholars basically just like read the book in Ethiopic and then looked at these citations in Greek and were like, oh, that's the thing. Like that's the book we're talking about. And so it has like this long tradition in Europe of being something that was known by like some of the early church fathers. Epiphanius knows about Jubilees and uses it. Jerome knows about Jubilees and uses it. It's like, so it's a book that's been known among the Christian Greek writers, but disappeared from basically everywhere except Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, it's actually part of the Bible in the Ethiopic Orthodox Church.
They seem to be pretty consistent in terms of holding on to stuff that like Enoch, one Enoch, you know, I'm pretty proud of the Ethiopian church for hanging on to this stuff, because this stuff is rooted in the New Testament, for example, but also keeping these traditions alive. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the really amazing thing, is the way Ethiopia has been in a way isolated from a lot of the rest of Christianity, but has then kept these traditions that were rooted out and or burned or whatever they were, that they were kind of discredited from the Christian church, or from also in Jewish circles, that they just lost their authoritative nature, their importance, their legitimacy, and so they weren't circulated anymore. But in Ethiopia, they were still copied and circulated and read up to today. So yeah, it's a great story. But Jubilees is even cooler because of the fact that this book that was known through Ethiopic and these Greek citations was found to be present in a ridiculous number of fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So when I say a ridiculous number of fragments, it's kind of like it's going a bit far, but we have like 15, 16, 17 different manuscripts that retain text from Jubilees found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wow. And that puts it on line with the most copies of biblical books. Like there's like Genesis and Isaiah have more, and the Psalms have more, but after that it's Jubilees. So it shows that it's a religious text that is very highly valued in the environment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So whether we want to call it the sectarians or the Yahad or the whatever we want to call that group, they did value this text very highly. But as I said, it's basically the textual history of what we know about Jubilees starts with knowing the entire book in Ethiopic. This, what's on the screen now, is Gunde Gunde 162. So it's a picture of one of the oldest manuscripts of Jubilees, and the textual history of Jubilees in Ethiopic goes back to the 1300s sometime. So that's what we have of manuscripts. We don't have older manuscripts than that. So anytime we're talking about Jubilees, we're talking about this 13th century and later, 14th century and later text in Ethiopic. But then we do also have a slightly earlier, or actually a lot earlier text that is very incomplete, found in a Latin palimpsest manuscript. So a palimpsest is a manuscript where some Jubilees was written on this manuscript, and then another text was written on top. So it was erased, and another text was written on it.
I always pronounced that palimpsest, but I'm horrible about pronunciation. So
I could be wrong too, man. I don't know. Somebody will correct us, I'm sure.
The reason why I called it that is in Islamic research, there's actually early Quran manuscripts that or if you will, I don't know if it's like the skin of an animal, but you could tell that they try to scrape off the previous Quran that was like a primitive version, and they call it the lower text palimpsest is how I always heard them say it. But palimpsest, it's the same thing.
Whatever. But this is that. So it's the same thing. I mean, this is also on parchment. On parchment. So it's animal skins that have been erased and scraped and washed, but using technology, you can see what's underneath, right? And so there's this great project that's been over the past few years, led by Todd Hannigan, who's basically re-imaged everything. This was discovered in the 1850s, that this palimpsest was there, palimpsest, whatever we want to call it.
I screwed you up.
I don't know what to say. This manuscript had text from Jubilees, but it doesn't have it all. I mean, we don't have all of it, but it has a good portion of it, and we can read it and kind of see that in the 4th or 5th century, there was a pretty similar text to what we have in the Ethiopic. So, but it's just not the whole thing. But then in the 1940s, 1950s, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And there we found, or not we, I wasn't there, but the guys who found them put together, these kind of, what do we say, 15, 16, 17, 18 manuscripts that had text from Jubilees. And the oldest of them probably dates to around the turn of the 1st century BC, so like about 100 BC, sometime in there. They're that old. They have actually even been carbon dated. That's one of the things I kind of found when I was playing with them in the IA's laboratory, was that there was notes that they had been carbon dated, and as far as we can tell, they've been carbon dated to sometime between 150 and 1 BC. So it doesn't help us a whole lot, but they're ancient. So these manuscripts contain, maybe like 1% of the text. As you can see from this picture, there's not a lot to work on, and we're going to come back to that, because that's what really came to be the focus of my research, was how do we get basically from the Hebrew text to the Ethiopic text, and what assumptions have scholars made in trying to reconstruct what's under there. So, and then of course there's all these citations in Greek, which are really fun. And so this is just a Greek manuscript of George Synkelos's Chronology, which is a kind of a good, one of the earliest good chronographical universal histories that uses Jubilees all over the place. So we have all these different sources to the text, but we're reliant on late Ethiopic manuscripts basically to know what Jubilee says. We'll get back to a little bit of that stuff later. But so for those who never have read Jubilees and never will, basically the highlights are that Jubilees is an alternate version of Genesis plus the beginning of Exodus. So it's situated on Sinai. The whole thing basically happens on Sinai. One of the times Moses goes up the mountain. And I mean, so, and I'm sure, Derek, I'm sure you've played this game too, and you go through and you read in Exodus, like how many times does Moses go up and how many times does he come down? And
it's wild.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, like, I don't know. I think there's like, it depends on who you ask, but there's like, 7 or 17 or whatever times he goes up and down and up and down, and he doesn't go down enough times compared to how many times he goes up. But one of these times is definitely the time, according to Jubilees, that an angel visits him and kind of gives him a new version of Genesis. And this story that is narrated by this angel of the presence, as he's called, who shows up, talks to Moses on Sinai, and then says, "Here is the revelation that you need," and then gives him this whole story. And this really plays into the conception of the Torah in its entirety having been given on Sinai, right? This idea that Moses wrote the whole Torah, then he would have obviously had to learn about those things in the past also while he was getting the law and all this stuff about the future. So there's this kind of, it plays on this idea that there was the one law, one Torah was given, and then we have this other one that Moses also gets. The biggest thing, like the biggest structural thing you'll see when you read Jubilees, is that Jubilees uses a completely different calendar and really wants you to know about the calendar. So everything is dated, everything is put into a solar calendar first. So that's it's the 364-day calendar is what's used in Jubilees, so that every single holiday will always fall on the same weekday. And this is important because there are some times when a holiday and preparations for a holiday could fall on a Sabbath. And so like if you know some of the Old Testament law, there's things like on the day before Easter, you need to go and slaughter this lamb and paint your doors and do all this stuff because that's what they did in Egypt. And then, but how can you slaughter that lamb if that happens to fall on the Sabbath, right? And this becomes a question in later Rabbinic Judaism as well. But the like Jubilees tries to kind of answer this by making sure that you never get those kind of collisions because they have a nice solar calendar. And then in addition to the solar calendar, it counts everything in numbers of Jubilees, so numbers of years of Jubilees. And the years of Jubilees are part of Levitical law, where like every 7 years, all things are pardoned and slaves are set free and all that kind of stuff. And then every 49 years or 50 years, so every year of Jubilees in the Old Testament, then like land is reverted to its owner, and you have these kind of like this major celebration of putting everything back where it belongs. And so like I'm supposed to make sure there's no debt and no slavery and no all that kind of stuff. But what happens in the book of Jubilees is that becomes the chronology from creation for everything. So everything is dated according to which Jubilee it happens in. So we're gonna look at some examples of that too. And then something that's also very fun that Jubilees does is it recasts all the patriarchs as following Mosaic law. So all the times the patriarchs do something that has to do with something legal, Jubilees comments on it especially. And this is kind of making sure Noah sacrifices the right things in the right way when he gets off the ark, or establishing the patriarchs as priests, so that we have this kind of idea that they knew about the priestly laws ahead of time, so that they weren't doing sinful things.
There are so many questions that I have in my head already, and like interesting side rabbit trails in all of these things that you just these bullet points. So I don't even think it's fair for me to even ask any questions, because we won't get any further.
Make note of some of that stuff and see if I answer any of it through the next few slides, and then just man, we can talk as much as you want. Just keep throwing it at me. And the final thing, which is very fun, and which is kind of enlightening for us who work with ancient Jewish and Christian texts, is the fact that it includes a lot of rewritten or alternate narratives for what happens in Genesis. So like when we talk about Jubilees being a rewriting of Genesis, like it's not just grouping things together in a slightly different way. Like it radically transforms some of the narratives and brings in other sources. So we have some Enochic material, like some of the stuff from First Enoch is in Jubilees as well. So it's using other sources, but like some of the things that Jubilees doesn't like, it just takes out. Some of the things where the patriarchs do something stupid, Jubilees writes it in a different way so that they actually sound like they're doing things in a better way. So we've got like a whole series of different narratives that you just don't have in other Jewish texts. So, to get an idea of how the book functions, we can look at the prologue, which is, we call it the prologue. It's just the beginning of Jubilees, which reads like this. This is the account of the division of the days of the law and the testimony for annual observance according to their weeks of years and their Jubilees throughout all the years of the world, just as the Lord told it to Moses on Mount Sinai when he went up to receive the tablets of the law and the commandment by the word of the Lord, as he said to him, come up to the top of the mountain. Now, this serves two functions basically in Jubilees. One is that it introduces the book and tells us what's coming. So this is about the days of the divisions, and it gives us the chronology and all that stuff. But it also makes the reader kind of associate this. So a really knowledgeable reader will associate this with Exodus 24. Where the Lord says to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and wait there that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction. Right. And this is one of those kind of key things that Jubilees is definitely playing on a kind of a gap or a hole in the narrative or a place in the narrative where the author can say, yeah, so there is a time because Moses was up there once and he got some laws, and then the Lord said to him, come up again, and here's the story about what happened then. And so it's like kind of using this exegetical technique of finding a place in the story where you can just kind of jump in and give it something new. And this is a very typical thing that happens throughout Jubilees, that you have like little exegetical tags that'll bring you in to the stories from the Torah. The basic outline after this is chapters 2 to 4 in Jubilees are creation and Adam stories. Then you have some Noah stories. You have a bunch of Abraham stories. And then there's this really long thing about Abraham's death where it's like all the predictions and there's some kind of apocalyptic stuff. And there's just a bunch of questions about what's happening with Abraham right there. And then Jacob shows up on the scene kind of earlier than you get him in Genesis. And then by the end, then it's stories about Moses. So Jubilees covers all the way through the Exodus. But the Exodus is like really compact in Jubilees compared to what you get in the book of Exodus. And so, but it is there. And one of the fun things about the story is that when you get to Moses, the angel who's narrating this whole thing starts talking to Moses in the second person, right? So he starts saying like, yeah. And so when I led you through the desert and when you were sent to Pharaoh to do the things. And so it's like, it's really like systematically made to make it a conversation between this angel and Moses.
Which would also give the reader the idea that this is actually an authentic account from the time of Moses himself, so that they are like, oh, this is authentic, that Moses himself is having a conversation with the angel. Read it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely keeps that, I don't know what word, like that kind of believability of it or something. Like it seems legitimate because the angel is speaking directly to Moses, who is supposed to be writing this thing down. And so it keeps that kind of idea of transmission alive. So I want to do a couple of texts in the Torah and in Jubilees just to illustrate some of these things that are happening. One is definitely my favorite, is the the Jubilees creation account, and we don't have time to go through all of it, but we can just look at how it transforms Genesis 1. So the first day is basically what we're looking at. So in the beginning, God created heavens and earth. This is Genesis. The earth was out without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said, saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So the author of Jubilees reads this and wants to rewrite what happens in creation, and sees a few problems in this text already, because there are some things that had to have been created then that aren't created, and some things which are mentioned but aren't mentioned as having been created. So Jubilees basically adds a whole lot of stuff to the creation story on the first day. So I'm gonna break this down. I'm not gonna read it all at once. I'm gonna break it down into parts so we can see the connections to other stuff. So Jubilees 2, so the creation story starts out like this. For on the first day he created the heavens which are above, and the earth, and the waters, and all the spirits which minister before him. Now, already here, the author is taking stuff that's written in Genesis 1 and making it like visibly created. And so we have like the heavens, right? So that's good. In the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. So we all know that. That's fine. But then like there's a problem is that we read that his spirit was over the face of the waters, but there's no comment in Genesis 1 about creating the waters. Right. And so Jubilees says, don't worry, he created the waters. Right. And then we have this, and the Spirit of God, what on earth is that? And so in Jubilees, this becomes the spirits, not the spirit. And so then that is basically what are the angels. So the angels and the spirits of God had to have been created on the first day. And so this is actually a discussion in a lot of different Jewish texts in the Second Temple period, and even in early Rabbinic Judaism. There's the question of what day were the angels created on, and so for Jubilees, like they make it very clear that they were created on the first day, and this probably has to do with the fact that they are mentioned in Psalm 104, I think, as worshiping God at the creation, and also in Job 38, the same thing happens. Like there's this, and the angels bowed down at when I set the pillars of the earth, or something like that, and so like that becomes a motivation for having them there. But then this really cool thing happens. You get this list of types of angels, right? And so it's the angels, and so he created, and all the waters, and all the spirits which minister before him, the angels of the presence, the angels of sanctification, angels of the spirit of fire, angels of the spirit of the winds, angels of the spirit of clouds and darkness and snow and hail and frost, the angels of resoundings and thunder and lightning, and the angels of the spirits of cold and heat and winter and springtime and harvest and summer, and all the spirits of his creatures which are in heaven and on earth. And so it's just like there's this massive list of angels and spirits that the author felt like he had to explain existed. And when we look at it, I mean, like some of them, it's just like, so some of them are taken directly out of the Bible. So like the angels of the presence, this is mentioned in Isaiah. So that's where the name, the angel of the presence, comes from. And he's the narrator, so he's already there. So he's got to mention himself in the thing. And then angels of sanctification, that's probably mentioned in the Bible, or plays on a thing from Ezekiel, but that's not a big deal. But then we get to angels of things that we don't understand is the category that I basically put them into. So it's like the angels of fire, because fire is alive and scary or whatever, and then it's something that we need. Angels of spirits of the winds. Winds are definitely something that wind, where does it come from and where does it go? Nobody knows, that whole thing. Clouds and darkness and snow and hail and frost and thunder and lightning, and all these things that you basically will go today would say these are natural phenomenon. Like this we know basically about darkness and snow and hail and frost. So we know these things, but in for Jubilees, these are anthropomorphized or angelomorphized or whatever we want to call it, and so they're depicted as being angels or spirits that control these things. And then we also get the seasons. So the winter and springtime and harvest and summer is also kind of saying these are also natural things, part of the year that just are controlled by something. Some of these things, we probably have an exegetical link to the Bible. So Psalm 148 has a lot of similarities with the Jubilees creation story. And verse 7 does say, like, praise the Lord from the earth, the great sea creatures and all the deeps, fire, hail, snow, and mist, stormy wind, fulfilling his word. So like this is probably part of the formation of Jubilees chapter 2 that there's, but I think there's probably some more steps before it gets there, but this is kind of one of the exegetical tags. But then when you look at this list again, there's so many things that just show us that the author is interested in explaining the natural with the supernatural, or the unexplainable with the supernatural. And so I think that's just like shows part of what's going on here in Jubilees. But again, some of these things do show up. So the abysses and the darkness, the evening and night, the light and the dawn. This is how the text continues. So God, he creates heavens and the earth, he creates the waters, he creates the darkness and the deep, and then he creates all these angels. But then Genesis 1 still has these things that are unexplained, right? Because there was darkness over the face of the deep. So we get the abysses and the darkness in Jubilees 2. And then God says, let there be light. Okay, finally we get to what we think was made on day 1, light. Okay, we get that in Jubilees 2. But then after light is created on day 1 in the Hebrew Bible, there's evening and there's morning, and we have like this whole evening thing that Jubilees 2 says, well, that had to have been created too. So then God must have created evening and night and dawn and daylight in addition to that. And so like by the end of it, we've covered like every word in Genesis 1 plus a whole lot of other random stuff. And then the author of Jubilees then counts this up and says, oh, God made 7 things on the first day. Like, dude, there's a lot of, I mean, I guess you throw all the angels into one and you say that darkness is both the evening and night and light is both the dawn and the daylight. And I mean, you play with it to make it work. But like for the author, this was 7, but it was more important that they get to 22 in the end, because the number of things made in creation was supposed to be 22, and that's what Jubilees figures out. That's 22, and 22 is this magic number in Jubilees. It's the number of the letters of the alphabet, the number of books of the Hebrew Bible. It's just like this kind of a hallelujah number. So the next story, just another story that illustrates Jubilees, like all this crazy stuff that's happening, is the story of the first murder, right? So Cain and Abel, we probably know it from Genesis, but so basically what happens, Cain and Abel make sacrifices to God, and God likes Abel's better than Cain's, and so Cain kills Abel. That's the gist of the Genesis story. Now, when we read it in Jubilees, it starts like completely different. So it starts like this: and in the 3rd week, in the 2nd Jubilee, she bore Cain, and in the 4th she bore Abel, and in the 5th she bore Awan, his daughter. So already here we get a bunch of things that you don't get in the Bible. So first is this Jubilees, the Jubilees chronology, using the weeks of years and the Jubilees. So a week of years is 7 years, and a Jubilee is 49 years. And so like to get to the number from creation, then you have to count like 49, and then you've had 2 complete cycles. So that's up to 63 or something. And so it's like the 3rd week then. So sometime between 64 and 70 after creation, Cain was born. And then the next set of seven, so between 71 and 77 or whatever, Abel is born. And the week after that, in years, Awan, the daughter, is born. And here we definitely get some information that you don't get in Genesis. The name of the daughter of Adam and Eve. And that's what I'm focused on right now in my research, actually. So we'll talk about this a bit more. But these names, like every generation between Adam and Abraham is given, daughters are given names. So you have, it's not the daughters, it's actually the wives usually. But here in Genesis, the Jubilees, the story about Adam and Eve, we get the daughters' names, and then everywhere else it's like the name of the wife of the patriarch, and so this becomes a big thing. But it's filling in some of that information that you just don't have when you read Genesis, right? Because you read Genesis and you're like, man, who did they marry? Like, it doesn't. Like, right. We got Abel, we got Seth. Who did they marry? And Jubilee says, we know who they married, actually. It was Awan and Azura. So we've got their names, and gives you like basically where they belong in the chronology. They show up.
It also speaks, I would suspect, because the practice was prevalent in different ancient Near Eastern sister wives and, really, genetically, right? Just kind of for those who really believe this stuff, literally, it just shows you Jubilee's author does not know the genetics and understanding what kind of hiccup this would ultimately have created, which is fine. I mean, it's an ancient, tale of origin stories and how to explain it, but it tells you he is not aware of the generational reproductive consequences of Awan and her sister marrying, the sons of their same parent. So anyway,
and I mean, and this is obviously a problem that is known, kind of, because there are Levitical laws against incest. So you're not supposed to marry your sister. But this is a massive problem in antiquity for basically anyone who's trying to reconstruct the world as coming from two people.
Right.
And so, I mean, we can talk about this another time probably, because there's so many cool stories about how basically they have there has to be sets of twins. And that's kind of the interpretation that most interpreters end up with in antiquity, is that obviously they were born as sets of twins. And so then like the laws and the genetics, all that applies like in the first few generations, basically just to your own twin. That would be a problem. But then if you marry outside your twin partner, then you're good to go. And so, but Jubilees is definitely not saying that. And so that's actually one of the really interesting things, is that in Jubilees, you can't interpret this as saying that Cain and Abel switched twins. But we do have that in the Syriac Book of the Cave of Treasures, which also kind of gives some stories about the first daughters. There's actually the story where Cain and Abel, Cain goes to Adam and says, I think my twin is prettier, so I'm going to go ahead and sleep with her. And Adam's like, what, you disgusting person, go to the Cave of Treasures and make a sacrifice to God, both of you bad boys, because you can't do incest. This is a horrible thing. And so they go to do it. And that is the sacrifice that God rejects of Cain.
Oh.
And then he goes out and kills his brother, but not because of a sacrifice, but because he wants his sister.
Oh, there's so many neat little mythological add-ons and stories to explain these things. I love learning this stuff. It just, like I said, I mean, there's degrees in which you're showing, which I love, but it's like, there's people still at that basic 101 fundamental that can't even get past this little hiccup without apologetic after apologetic after. And it's like, come on, like they didn't know maybe, or maybe they didn't care. Maybe they thought, well, we were close to the beginning. There's even people who talk about our genetics were far more pure then, and you could get away with it. And then over time, so it's just one excuse after another to try and make it true. But when you stop trying to play that game, it's so much fun.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and if you just say, okay, so they're just stories, man. Like,
yeah,
they're stories, and then it becomes almost like fan fiction.
Yeah.
Like, you're like, wait, how did this happen? You're like, dude, I've got a great story about that. And then like, I mean, you just like, you see how like things grow and spread, and it's, you know, that, and if that's it, then it's fun. If it becomes like your explanation for life, then it becomes a bit tricky.
Right.
Yeah, that's just that's the Genesis story. So I'll jump past that. So basically what happens in the Jubilees version of this story is it then gives a very easy summary of what happens. But then after the murder, and God basically curses Cain, then it says, and therefore it is written in the heavenly tablets, cursed is one who strikes his fellow with malice. And all who have seen and heard shall say, so be it. And the man who saw it and did not report it shall be cursed like him. And therefore, when we come before the Lord our God, we will make known all of the sins which occur in heaven and earth, and which are in the light or in the darkness or in any place. So there's like, this is an awesome text because there's so much weird stuff, right? So first of all, we get introduced to this idea that there are these heavenly tablets, right? There is a copy of the law up there in heaven, which the angel can narrate from or knows about at least. And these things are basically, so when Cain kills Abel, it has to be related to an eternal law. It's always been illegal to kill, or illegal or wrong, or whatever we want to call it. It's always been against the law to kill, and it's been written there. They're the heavenly tablets. So what can you do? You can't argue with that. And so and throughout Jubilees, the angel will break into the narrative occasionally and say, by the way, this is written on the eternal heavenly tablets. So it is like that. And sometimes it's when the patriarch does something that they definitely want to be established as an eternal law. And sometimes it's used to explain why the patriarch is doing something different than you would expect or would have known from Genesis or things like that. So there's like all these situations where it's just like, yeah, this is on the eternal tablets. So yeah, it's good. It was a law before Sinai. It's always been a law.
I also noticed that like this is another way of explaining how like anything you do is going to be known, because in Cain's in the Genesis initial, the blood tells on Cain, or on Cain. Abel's blood told me what you did, whereas in this it sounds like, you know, like the heavenly tablets are telling on you. Everything in heaven is watching and knows what you're doing. And if you are watching this and you see it happen, you're going to be cursed with them. So it already is creating this like guilt conscious. You can't get away with anything. Don't think that the law, you can hide from the law kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's a really great point, and it's really interesting when we see this thing, like when we come before the Lord our God, we will make known, right? And this is an angel talking, so it's an angel saying that there are angels watching over your shoulder to report your good and bad deeds, right? Does that sound familiar to you, Derek?
Yes.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, both the eternal tablets, the heavenly version of the holy book that on the law and all that, and this idea of this, there's angels watching over to report your deeds that happen. Like this could have been straight out of the Quran, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just so there's a really strong parallel between some of these ideas of angels and what they do and the heavenly books and things like that we see between Jubilees and the Quran.
Thank you.
So basically, yeah, I just like that picture, so I brought it back up again. So the other story I wanted to talk about is the sacrifice of Isaac in Jubilees. And this, I mean, so basically people probably know this one. This is a story where Abraham gets told by God to take his son, and take him up on the mountain and sacrifice him. And Abraham says, okay. And they go. And when he gets up on the mountain, he prepares the sacrifice. And Isaac says, where's the lamb? And Abraham says, oh, God will provide the lamb. And then he ties him up, and he's about to slaughter his son and set him on fire. And then the angel calls out, no, don't do it. And then there's a ram stuck in the bushes or something like that. And this is a story that's, told very differently depending on whether you're in a Jewish, Christian, or Muslim context, where in obviously in Islam, it's not Isaac, it's Muhammad, not
Ishmael,
Muhammad,
yeah.
Who's the son. And this makes it very different. But like even in Christian and Jewish circles, like there's a discussion about whether or not, Isaac was old or young. Like, is Isaac a grown man when this takes place? Is he like willfully going along and sacrificing himself? Or, what's the moral of the story? Is it Abraham's obedience? Is it Isaac's? What's the big deal? But Jubilees doesn't like this story, but it's so important that it has to be there. And so what Jubilees has done is recast it to make it so God's not just like looking for bad stuff. And so Jubilees looks like this. And it came to pass in the 7th week, in the 1st year, in the 1st month, in that Jubilee, on the 12th of that month. Oh God, yeah. The words came in heaven concerning Abraham, that he was faithful in everything which was told him, and he loved the Lord and was faithful in all affliction. And Prince Mastema came, and he said before God, behold, Abraham loves Isaac his son, and he is more pleased with him than everything. Tell him to offer him as a burnt offering upon the altar, and you will see whether he will do this thing, and you will know whether he is faithful in everything in which you test him. So Mastema is the devil du jour, like the devil of the times in Jubilees. So basically, and like I know you've done some videos on the development of Satan and stuff like that. And so like Satan has this development where it goes from basically being a word like a deceiver or something like that, where in some texts that there was a deceiver, to being like this anthropomorphized being that does deceiving, and then like all this bad stuff happens around him. And Mastema is basically kind of the same thing. So Mastema is the Jubilees bad demon guy. So there is one place at least where another bad demon guy, Belial, is also mentioned, but I think that's a textual thing so we don't have to worry about that. But so Mastema is also mentioned in other Dead Sea Scrolls and is known from antiquity, but he's basically the devil. He's the prince of the demons in Jubilees, and here like you might have already made the association to the story that I'm going to bring up next, because this reminds us a lot of something we see in the book of Job.
Exactly, right? What I was thinking. Yep. Yeah.
So in the book of Job, just for those of you that don't know it, basically the exact same story happens, but explains why God punishes Job or lets bad things happen to Job. So it begins like this. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan was also among them, or the deceiver maybe was among them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on all the earth. There's blameless and upright man who fears God, turns away from evil. And Satan says, oh, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house, and have blessed him, and blah blah blah? But if you stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, he will curse you to your face. And then God says, okay, give it a go. Like, do your best. And that like is the premise for the whole book of Job, where basically Job loses everything, and then he argues with his friends about whose fault it is. But when we look at this Jubilees story, it is framing this like horrible thing that could be asked of Abraham, who is supposed to be the hero of the religion. And it frames it as God actually having faith in Abraham. right? Like it turns the whole thing around. It's not God saying, "Do Abraham, are you faithful?" But it's saying like, here comes Mastema and says, Abraham only like he wouldn't sacrifice his son. It wouldn't happen. And God says, "I believe in Abraham." And so it's like this like crazy like I'd say like whitewashing of the story that Abraham is not like, there was never a doubt. Like if God knows Abraham is going to be faithful, then we're already safe. Like it's totally cool. And so we get the story, and it's basically the same story. But one of the really interesting things is that this story, is retold in another manuscript that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is labeled among the Dead Sea Scrolls as pseudo Jubilees, because the first editors who worked with it, they really, they saw something so similar because they saw this basically the same story here being told, but then instead of it being Mastema, we see Mastema and Belial. And then there's some other textual differences. And so these editors said, oh, well, it's not Jubilees, but it's basically like Jubilees, so we'll call it pseudo Jubilees. I think it's, I think it's silly to call things that almost are the same as something different, but I think it just shows more and more how things are developing all the time in antiquity. And there's this story was actually really convincing when it was told in Jubilees that some other demon got involved and got God to do something that he wouldn't have done, which got Abraham to do something that he wouldn't have done. But everybody knows the whole time that it's to prove the devil wrong, basically.
Yeah, that's the whole, from what I can get the gist, is they tied it into this Job-like narrative, because even then in Job, it's ugly. Like, why would God do this to Job? But it's not God. Remember now, he's just, God is testing him. But remember, you got to blame this guy who came and asked and like tested God. Exactly. And so they're doing that exact thing here to get God off of the hook, because it's really, really bad, which might tell you that the Abraham story is pretty old. I don't know how old, but if you go further back, would they have been ashamed of such a text? I don't know. I mean, especially if human sacrifice was somewhat still around when the text was being written. So, by the 1st century BC, it's probably no good, especially when Hellenism comes in.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, and that's a great point, is that once we're in the Hellenistic period and later, like it does change how these texts, like the older texts are viewed, I think, and then they're retold in a different way, which really tells us that these guys that come out there like, oh, Greek ethics or whatever, like that's the bad thing, that like we're lucky we have a Christian moral because the Greeks would be out there raping babies or whatever they say. Like they say really weird stuff, and like this kind of really shows you that actually Hellenism and rewriting things after Hellenism hits Judaism, they're actually going back and trying to clean up some of that bad stuff that was going on, like say, no, that wasn't really as bad as you might have thought. And I think that's showing that there's actually a Greek influence that makes them want to appear better, like than what they think those stories are actually appearing as.
The Greek philosophers were doing it with their gods in the Homeric epics and stuff. So yeah, I think philosophy may have played a significant role in morality and the development of how we view the world. So
yeah, I've got a little bit more here. So I just, that's all I'm going to do of text. I just want to walk you through a little bit of what I did in my dissertation, what I've done a little bit afterward, because my whole thing was basically on textual criticism of Jubilees, or looking at the text and asking questions about what do we really think about textual stability and stuff like that in antiquity. And so one of the first things that I noticed that got me kind of rolling in my research was that if you look at things in the textual form that we have it, like you get this feeling like everything is great, like you know exactly what was written in Hebrew. And so this is the main critical edition of Jubilees that was published by James Vanderkam, who is basically like the god of Jubilees. I mean, he's written everything and written about everything, and has a 2-volume giant commentary on Jubilees, and like, so he's like, anytime you say anything about Jubilees, you're either agreeing with him or trying to prove him wrong. It seems like that's kind of so. But he's still alive. He's been at Notre Dame. He's a great scholar, and had done a ridiculous amount of work on Jubilees. But he in '89 published the Ethiopic text, which basically is a collation of like 15 of the 27 manuscripts that were available to him at the time. And so there's like 27 manuscripts that he was able to check, and then he chose the 15 best and kind of worked from there. Now there's over 50 manuscripts available, so like there's more, but still, I mean, if you think about like a lot of books of the Bible and things like this, like what we're saying is that Jubilees critical edition is so it's a translation of a translation, right? So Jubilees was written in Hebrew, translated to Greek, and then to Ethiopic, and then we have here about 15 manuscripts giving us the text. And if you just think about the numbers compared to what we have of Hebrew or Greek texts, and the number of manuscripts that go behind that kind of textual criticism, it's pretty crazy. In the same year, he published a translation with notes. And so Jubilees is from that time, basically that was the standard edition and standard translation that everybody used. And this was basically the textual commentary as well, up until he published more stuff. Vanderkam was also co-editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls Fragments of Jubilees. These were originally worked on by Joseph Milik, who was one of the original team of Dead Sea Scrolls scholars. And Milik, I think, did a lot of the placing of the scrolls, identifying of text and stuff like that. And then Vanderkam came in kind of in this second wave of publication and did all the final textual work and publication. But what we see here, like, again, if you just look at this, what you see is apparently a pretty good text, right? It looks like the first couple lines are missing, and then everything else looks pretty dandy. And this is the translation then that's published by Vanderkam and Milik in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Discoveries in the Judean Desert series, which is the standard edition. But when I went to look at this kind of stuff, what I found was that for this was what was extant, right? And so I started kind of trying to figure out what is actually textually retained and what is, I guess you could say, restored from the Ethiopic. And so I made a font I did some photoshopping and made a font out of the letters and tried to be able to, sort it all out. And so this is what we have for that first column of Jubilees. And this is what is reconstructed around it. Okay. So that is what it looks like with all the text there. That is the actual extant. That is the restored, and that's the complete. So when we look at this, you see that there's a lot of stuff that was missing. And
right.
It's been restored from a translation of a translation. And so my big question was basically how much of this is actually there? Like, how much can we know? And so on this screen, you see the textual problems in what we have.
Wow. So imagine what we don't have.
Exactly. Right. So imagine what it would be for all the stuff that's missing.
So as far as, and maybe you're getting into this, but like as far as what we do see, and we know, hold on, looking at the Ethiopic version, this is not, like, these words that I have highlighted and read are not in that Ethiopic version, even though it is a translation of a translation. Do they not even work in the context? Like, is it evident that it was actually saying something different than what we have?
So some of them are just pretty simple stuff that it's using either a different word, or it's using a word that the Ethiopic uses a pronoun, or it's just simple grammatical stuff that all of your evangelist friends will tell you are meaningless things that obviously don't affect the meaning of the text or whatever. But some of them are very clearly just something we don't have. So like here, like we can't even reconstruct what it would have said. Right. So if you look here, and there's this like there's something missing. There's something we don't know.
So if you, and like, just to get me as a non-expert who's not aware of this, what we're looking at right here is what we have extant from the Dead Sea Scroll. We know what this says. This middle one, if you go back to the one after the Dead Sea Scroll, that one, what is that? Nope, before that one. That one. What is this? This is a reconstruction, you said, but
yeah, it's a reconstruction. So what's happened is that I really believe that. So this is one of the things that like is a little hard to know sometimes, because so the publication is in two names, but there's two guys basically I don't think worked together on it. Like Joseph Millick, he worked on this very early, like in the 1950s, and you can even go through some of the photos and see where he starts to find where things belong together, stuff like that. But I'm pretty convinced that he did the retro version, we call it, from Ethiopic. So he knew the Ethiopic text because this was published like 1901. We have this English guy Charles. R.H. Charles, I don't ever remember his whole name. R.H. Charles published an Ethiopic text based on 4 manuscripts that he knew of, and so this is like, and an English translation, and so this is like Millick's retro version of Jubilees from the Ethiopic, based on, I'm guessing, Charles's version to Hebrew, right? So he is making the Hebrew here. And there are a couple of things that are really difficult about this. One thing is just that in a retro version, you always are uncertain. Like you would never know exactly how things got there. Sometimes philologists are awesome at what they do, and sometimes they are so wrong. And that's just part of the game. Like you can make educated guesses, but it's not a computer. You can't just plug things in and get the right answer. And the other problem is orthography. So like one of the things that we see in these, so this manuscript has actually 2 different like hands have written it, and they're sewn together. And we have basically some from Jubilees 1 and some things from Jubilees 2, and that's it. That's all we have on this particular manuscript. And it's the hand that has done the first page is much later than the other one. And so like, there's theories about how or why this happened. And it could be that it was a replaced part of a manuscript because it got ruined, and so they rewrote it. Or it could be that it was never meant to be more than just these 2 texts, but somebody was working on, connecting them or something like that. But anyway, they're sewn together. And the orthography in the earlier part, so Jubilees 2, has some kind of telltale signs of these kind of longer writings that you see. So like they have like an extra consonant that helps you know what the vowel will be. You have some extra, like there's just some things that happen in later Hebrew, and especially at Qumran, and we can see that in the extant text. And the first page doesn't have those same features at the same level. And so like, how do you know to what degree you're reconstructing variant orthographies, variant writings of certain words? And that makes a difference about how many words you're going to get on a line, or how many letters you're going to get on a line, which then means how do you know where to place the fragments, and where do you start the next line? And I mean, there's just this snowball effect of problems. And so like when you have all this reconstructed, whatever, and 98% of the text is reconstructed, when you look at all the manuscripts together, like we don't know a ton. Like we do know that in some places, like when we look here, like, yeah, there are definitely some things like we can see like right here, like it says the first line on the right side of the screen says Autoshah something, and it means like to the top of the mountain. And so like we can place this in the story of Jubilees, that it's like in the beginning when the angel or the Lord says to Moses to come up to the top of the mountain, and we can say, okay, yeah, that fits in really good. But then like we get down and like there's these like little bitty letters, we have like 3 letters or 2 letters, and like, okay, so we have the mountain or we have to something, and like these fit in okay with reconstructing, but you just don't know how much you can reconstruct accurately.
Right. Okay.
And then when we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places on this little fragment where something's different, then, I'm very skeptical to us being able to talk about an extremely high level of stability. So that's basically what I did, was do this to this manuscripts, and in my reconstruction of it, we end up with I didn't have a picture there, so we end up with a manuscript that doesn't have actually like some kind of key parts of the Book of Jubilees that are very clearly like redactional additions, if you're using redaction criticism. And so like people have theorized about that these sections were later additions before, but then when I kind of redesigned the manuscript and looked at what I think the fragments actually kind of witness, then that lined up like perfectly with these seams in the text to say like those probably weren't there at all, which basically means that Jubilees also was still being written, still being redacted, still growing, like much later than what people had assumed. And
well after the Dead Sea Scrolls, to put it simply.
Well, to put it at least into the Dead Sea Scrolls period.
Okay.
And so this is one of those things where because I'm a scholar that has to maintain some scholarly integrity, I have to say I don't have an opinion, but I do have an opinion. Like I think that Jubilees was I think it would be very. There are some good reasons to suspect that Jubilees might have been undergoing redaction at Qumran.
Right.
Like that was actually happening. Like that some of these things are results of it. And some other scholars that have said that, like, because Jubilees is really important for Qumran, for the Dead Sea Scrolls, because of the calendar, because the calendar in Jubilees reflects what's being used at Qumran. And so there could be a connection there. So I do have a thing on the names of the wives of patriarchs. I think we'll leave that for another time because we've already been going for so long, but we'll come back to that. But rather, if you want to just, I'll turn off my share screen there, and there we are, and we can just chat a bit if you want.
I love this. By the way, I love everything that you brought up. It's so interesting and exciting and fun to do this stuff. I don't want any answers to questions. I want to throw out a few questions. And the reason why is I like to share. And I really want our audience to get in on this. And if they have questions, bring them so we could do a live hangout and have them ask their questions. Let me throw, just to get your chuckle, of a couple questions to give you an idea of like where my head was going in some of this, without necessarily any answers coming from you, but just to kind of have fun before we let you go.
All right.
So I had written down Enoch and Jubilees, especially with the solar thing. I was like, hold on, Enoch lived in the Bible 365 years. Hint, sounds like a son. And then the angel giving Moses and the patriarchs a law. A couple things that were coming to my head was like, okay, Moses is going up high. Mountaintops usually are touching the heavens. Well, this weird thing you were describing is like there's these what we call these heavenly tablets. It's like God's just handing him one of these, it's like, hey, here's a copy of what's really been here the whole time, which makes me get into this patriarch thing, which means before Moses' law, how did they know unclean animals? How did you look at Genesis, right? We see this confused issue with Judah. How does he know about Levirate marriage laws? Like, what the heck is going on with Cain and Abel? How do they know what to sacrifice or how to sacrifice? You name it. And there are people, just to throw out there, that think they have this concept. They think Adam is Israel. Now, this is like a modern theological issue where they want to say that in Genesis, Adam, all the way to Abraham, potentially all the way to Moses, is really a mythological secret story of Israel's later history. Why? Well, they find anachronisms, like we're talking about with the law. I don't think that these authors were thinking, I'm going to write a code. This is my opinion, but I'd love to get you to dive into this and we could pick this apart, because there's real academic scholars who've written books. Adam is Israel. And it's like, hold on. Like, I don't think they intended you to interpret that way. I think they really want you to follow the genealogy and assume his daddy begat him and all the way to, and boom. So, if you want to, you can comment. You just don't. I just don't want to give away too much.
That one, so I love it. You brought up the Judah and Tamar thing. Like, that's I'll for the next round, I'll put a slide together about that, because that story does get treated very well in Jubilees. And so that's because, again, it's one of those things where one of the patriarchs screws up majorly, and everyone's going, wait, was he the bad guy? What do we do with this? And Jubilees, like, this is one of the times when the angel actually intervenes into the narrative and says, like, talks about the laws and says, and this was written on the heavenly tablets about all the laws, and you can't do this and you can't do that and you can't do the other. But Judah isn't touched by these laws. And so it's like, it really gives you the conclusion that Judah made no sin. And so, there's like, I mean, it really does actually try to fix the problem in both cases. Like, how did he know? On the one hand, well, it's in the eternal laws, it's on the heavenly tablets, so no big deal. But then also, Judah isn't actually, and I think, I mean, so now I'm drawing a bit of a blank, but I think the reasoning is because nobody actually had sex with her until Judah did. So
really,
like I think that's like the whole thing, because
one of them spilled. Well, it sounded like in Genesis there was a pull-out situation.
But this is, and then that raises that question of what is sex, right? What is doing the deed? Is it actually inseminating someone? Whatever. But because like the first son dies before he could make a baby, whatever, and then Onan does his pull-out. Or whatever happened there, we don't really know, because it doesn't really say in the text that it was a pullout. Like it,
I always thought it.
And it does. Like, he spills the seed on the ground, right? That's what it says. And so then the question is just how did it get there? Like, there's other ways that could have come about.
It's interesting, yeah.
But then, like in Jubilees, then it's like, so what happens is that so basically, it is his daughter-in-law, which is a bad thing, but it's not because she was never like actually brought into into the right way.
Okay.
And so,
they make Judah innocent, is what your point is. Right.
Yeah, because Judah has to be innocent. Because Judah has to be innocent. Like,
yeah.
That's the thing. And that's like what Jubilees does, is the patriarchs have to be innocent.
Just like Chronicles has David practically have to be innocent. This is great. This is great.
And this is what the early scholars that were working with Jubilees said. I mean, this has like was the narrative in the beginning was, look, we have a Chronicles version of Genesis, because Chronicles whitewashes not only David, but also like Hezekiah and Solomon. And, so we get like this narrative that the big guys don't mess up. And so that's what Jubilees kind of continues, that line of thinking that, we've got to make sure that everybody knows that this didn't go down like that. Like, it wasn't like, we're not, because if Judah's bad, that's horrible. Like, but it apparently wasn't horrible until the time of the chronicler and later. So, yeah.
I jotted down a few more notes, questions, and one of them was conflating Exodus and Genesis. I felt like they were trying to bridge that gap. It just felt like an unnatural trying to merge the two. But in all of this, it's kind of complex. There's layers to this, but it's in that question of anachronisms too. So there's something going on that's really weird. Creating water. This is what was really weird to me in what you were talking about. I noted that they want to give water its creator.
Yep.
And I wondered if, and I'm completely out here in speculative land, but if Hellenism's on the scene and they have engaged with the Greco-Roman world, or the Greek world, let's just say, but the Roman world is on the rise here. We do know that from Daniel. We know that from there's some stuff going on here. I would say that's beginning to happen. I know that the God that is the creator, if you will, of the water, if I'm not mistaken, is in the Greek world is Hydros.
Right.
So they have a source to say where water comes from. Yeah. And if they don't have that already figured out in the Hebraic mind, because they're borrowing or from the Babylonian Mesopotamian background, let's say, and Assyrian and all that, they don't really explain how water came to be. The Greeks would have come in and probably made them feel like, hey, we've got to make sure we have our God also creating water, because in our text, we don't have him creating water. I'm hypothesizing here. I wrote down Hydro, Gaia, and Kronos just for the heck of it. I mean, this could be a complete leap. I could be way off. I'm just saying I found that very, very strange. And then the way that the spirits from singular to plural, this really made me think, okay, here we have already subordinate, instead of calling them other Elohim as of lower gods, they're already coming with this thing we call, where we start getting into Greek and they want to call the Elohim angels, and we start to change because there's only one God above supreme. It makes you wonder if this is where there's already this kind of proto, let's make sure we only have one God as our chief. And there's no other gods, if that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. And that's for that last point, that for me, it's almost too obvious to even talk about, is that this is a much more monotheistic context. And so basically you've explained the problem in Genesis 1:26, 1:27 by introducing other beings that are subordinate to God at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So you say there's angels and spirits that ministered to him and they praise him at the creation and all this stuff. And then when he says that, let's create man in our image, he's got somebody to talk to. And this isn't a B'nai Elohim situation where you say, well, maybe not, they're not, no. We're past that. We're past that stage of development when this text is written. And It's they're subordinate beings, created beings that were created after the beginning of creation.
Right. This solves that. And then the last one, and I'd love to rabbit trail, but we have to save it. Why isn't Jubilees known in rabbinic literature? Why aren't they using this? What is their beef with the literature of the Jubilees? What the heck, man? Because it makes me think, why aren't we seeing it in the Talmud? Are we seeing it? Maybe, there's a reference here or there that they've known, but we kind of lost it through history. I don't know. I think we should save these wonderful questions for a live stream.
Yeah. I will. I'll make sure to put together also what I do know about that, and I give you some textual examples. But there's, you insinuated that there's not a lot, so it's a really good question.
Thank you. Well, any final words you'd like to say to the audience? Maybe a recap. What is a recap of Jubilees, and why? What's so shocking about this information? If someone who's lost along the way and they're like, this was a little over my head, why is this so shocking, what you're describing?
Yeah. So Jubilees, the most shocking thing, the most amazing thing about Jubilees, I think for most people, is just the fact that we have a text that radically re-envisions the Torah, re-envisions Genesis in the 1st century BC. So there's definitely a concept of the stories behind Genesis being important. but there is no concept of that they're so holy in their textual form that they have to remain that way. Because the author of Jubilees can go in and say, nope, the calendar was wrong. The patriarchs did things right. All the laws were on a heavenly tablet that you've never heard about. And everything else can be crafted and changed and fixed in certain ways without it being a problem.
So there's not like a golden standard of what we call canon. It's flexible and it's...
Exactly. Like I mean, for me, it just breaks down completely the idea of what a canonical text could be. So like we can say, sure, Jubilees knows Genesis and obviously wants to show the importance or relevance of Genesis. But that doesn't mean it sees Genesis as this wholly untouchable text. Like it breaks it apart and basically says in some places, what Genesis is trying to say isn't a good thing, so we're going to drop it. And so there's just such a clear unraveling of the idea that you had to read the text of the Torah in a certain way or else you were wrong. That just isn't there because we have it in Jubilees. We have it, and then we have it in other Qumran texts as well, right? We have it in the rewritten Pentateuch manuscripts and things like that, where we see that you can, in the 1st century BC, even in the 1st century AD, you can reinvent the way the narratives of Genesis are written, and that's totally fine. And that goes against all ideas of a really fixed canon of a stability from the time of Ezra into whatever. It's just not there.
To put it bluntly, for those watching, this is obviously a jab at Christianity in many ways in terms of the way that they fixed everything and this is the way it should be. I'm not saying some Orthodox churches are kind of open-minded with flexibility with the text, but don't you ever test or challenge the church itself. It becomes the immutable object. To Orthodox Judaism in particular, this would be a jab at that and the idea that the Jews have always had this fixed since Ezra onward, or that there was a stop in prophetic prophets, if you will, and the way that they have their whole idea of canon. Every single school of thought pretty much gets touched by Jubilees in some magical way. And I hope if you're watching this and you were like me, a fundamentalist who believed in the inerrant infallibility, immutability of God's word, and it was perfect, it was God-breathed, and this is exactly what God wanted, et cetera, I hope you see the flexibility. I hope you see through and that whole foundation cracks and your faith matures. I encourage it. But to stop with that whole, those are progressive scholars and we have the conservative exegetical approach. Listen, they're all doing eisegesis according to the definitions that they love to spout. So it was very common that Jews themselves, not only New Testament authors, which love to kind of rehash and midrash and use the text however they wanted, so did the Jews. So it's not just a Christian thing, it's a Jewish thing. And you know what? I love it. And I hope you do too. I hope you find this educational. I hope you find this freeing. And this gives you enthusiasm to want to go study more and to learn more about our history, our past, and all these texts. Dr. Munger, thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry I had to give that spiel because this is a fantastic episode.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks a lot, man. I really enjoyed this. And like I said, I'm happy to do a live stream or whatever you want to set up. And we can, really hash out the kind of questions on whatever. I'm definitely game for that.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, go down in the description. Check out our links. Also help support us here at MythVision. Join the Patreon. Don't miss out on any of the fun stuff. And never forget, we are MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon, not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision.